Hello and welcome back to Restaurant Planet Podcast with me, your host, Jack Cole. So today I'm joined by Sofia Castello y Tigel from Conservation Optimism, who's going to tell us a little bit about the organisation, what it is that they do. So welcome, Sophia. So start by telling us a little bit about your background and where the idea for the network came from.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jack. It's great to be here and be able to kind of talk a little bit about conservation optimism and the work that we've done over the years. I suppose I can start a little bit about my background. I am the interim director for Conservation Optimism currently. So we became an official charity recently, and our kind of I guess like I'll remit a little bit. One of our volunteers came up with this is like a movement and mindset for nature and people. So the idea being to sort of focus on solutions and maintaining energy and community and finding and amplifying what works within conservation rather than focusing on the threats. But yeah, sort of in terms of where I'm coming from, I grew up between Mexico and England. I have a background in marine ecology and conservation research, but also doing some more creative stuff like films and writing and comedy. My undergrad was in biology and photojournalism. I did a master's in biodiversity conservation and management, and then did a PhD in zoology at Oxford with E.J. Garland, who was the founder of Conservation Optimism. So yeah, I got involved with the movement when it started in 2016, when EJ sort of initially had the idea of really needing to be sort of connecting up lots of people within conservation in order to talk about what's working, build a sense of community, and sort of up the positivity and sort of try to maintain hope as much as possible. So Conservation Optimism started, it was initially meant to be a one-off summit. So it was like a conference that happened in early 2017. I think it was April 2017. And the idea was to bring lots of people together, share stories of success, and do that not only with academics, who are the people who usually attend conferences maybe, but also including people like artists, people who are working at NGOs, government, kind of conservationists from different backgrounds. And that initial conference just went so well, like people seemed to really enjoy it. And then the movement started building on social media. We had a second summit and became a charity last year. So yeah, it's growing.
Brilliant. And tell me a little bit about what makes conservation optimism slightly different from perhaps other groups, obviously in the name optimism. So could you break down a little bit the sort of the ethos and the motivation behind it and the kind of broader message that you're trying to spread?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's apparent to anyone who works in conservation or cares about nature and the environment that we're facing some pretty big issues. We have species declining, we have ecosystems being lost, and conservation can be effective, but maybe we kind of want to be scaling up our efforts. And it can be really overwhelming to be surrounded by this sense of doom and gloom. There can be a very strong focus sometimes on threats rather than solutions. And so we really want to kind of amplify those solutions and try to figure out what's working. At essentially, conservation can be sometimes also a bit of a narrow place, and so it's not necessarily that inclusive. Our sort of goals overall is that we really want everyone to feel empowered to act for nature. We'd love to see lots of stories shared of what's going on, the things that are working, the things that maybe haven't worked, but we can learn from, and really be trying to sort of replicate successes as well whenever possible, or contribute to that in some way. We work in lots of different ways. So for example, we have a presence on social media, we have a blog, which, for example, you've written for. We hold webinars. We have a film festival every year, which features short films and hopeful stories. We have a podcast as well, which is currently on pause. We have a network called Conservation Now, which organizations can join. who share this ethos of wanting to kind of be positive within conservation. We also have hubs in India, Pakistan, and Ghana. So those are groups that were started up by people in those countries who believe in the ethos of conservation optimism and want to bring it to their contexts. We do a bit of research on successes in conservation and positive communication. And we also work to help people tell their stories effectively. So doing some capacity building around positive communication.
And what different effects does sharing a positive message have from a negative message?
It's an interesting question.
Sorry to interrupt. More, rather than just negative, but coming with the kind of the idea of, you know, being optimistic, of course, we're going to get there, we're going to find solutions, let's come together, let's feel good about this, as opposed to it's the end of the world, it's the apocalypse, you know, run for the hills.
Let's hope it's not the apocalypse. I hope it's not the apocalypse.
Right, of course. But what different effects do these different types of messaging have on people?
It's a great question. We did a bit of work on this last year. So we published a paper, and that was kind of a literature review looking at lots of different work that had been done in climate change communication and just sort of around messaging in general. And I think that one thing to say is that in positive communication or like optimistic messaging, it doesn't mean that everything that you're saying has to be positive, right? Like, and all of us are working in conservation, like we know that we're facing big problems. We know that there's a lot going on that isn't like the world right now doesn't look like what we want it to look like. And that is okay to acknowledge. It's important to accept that things are difficult right now. But the ethos behind positive communication and messaging is that moving from awareness to action requires more than just providing information about threats. Because when you do that, it can actually be kind of disempowering and overwhelming to whoever is receiving that messaging, and especially if they're receiving it kind of as an onslaught over and over again. And so using these tools around positive communication, messaging can help people develop productive collaborations, relationships, have better conversations, and ultimately trigger some actions to help address the biodiversity crisis. So when we're looking at what, for example, what is positive communication or what is positive messaging, it contains overall kind of 4 elements, right? Like this is what we put forward in that paper. First of all, it's a clear description of the issue at hand, along with some possible paths or actions that can be taken at the individual level for whoever happens to be reading this, considering audience appropriate context and language. So you wouldn't necessarily talk to everybody the same way. And you want to be thinking about what's already in your audience's head in order to make sure that what you want to say to them is getting there. And then the last thing is to try to avoid disempowering emotions. And emotions, so we do say in the paper, like that, I think there was a quote from someone who I can't remember exactly right now, who just said like emotions aren't simple levers, right? Like it's not like I can be like, sadness will make you act like this, or happiness will make you act like this. But overall, from the literature, we can see that there are certain types of emotions that can prime us to kind of feel and act in certain ways when we are thinking about conservation. So emotions that might be labeled as kind of negative, so things like fear and anger and shame, they can narrow our focus. And in a lot of ways, they can maybe help us to respond to immediate threats, but they also might kind of change our perception of risks and end up exhausting people over the long run. And ultimately, what we want to do in conservation is like, you know, it seems like we're in this for a while. I don't think we're going to be solving it tomorrow, even if I wish that we could. And so emotions like hope and love and pride and happiness, what they can do is that they can help broaden and build attention. They can enable things like curiosity, flexibility, creativity, collaboration. And ultimately, that's so important because we are in this as a marathon, not a sprint, and we need to be working together. So those are some of the things that positive communication can bring to the table, even as different types of messaging all have their place and might be priming people in different ways and helping them to take different types of action.
Yeah, something I think is very interesting in the paper that you co-authored was there was a point where, something you mentioned there of people go through these cycles of sort of, and given the nature of conservation, it's very emotional. It's not just, you're sort of in it all the time. It's always happening, especially in my life. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, sort of using it as a network, and it's just a constant stream of just horror and it can be quite
Oh no.
exhausting. And something really interesting in your paper was it was showing these actionable methods that people can employ to avoid that exhaustion and that cycle. Because quite often what happens in conservation quite widely is it's quite high turnover of people just experiencing burnout. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit to some of the actionable things that someone could do who's really, wants to get involved, but perhaps is just starting out or doesn't have, conservation background. What are some actionable things that someone can do to make them feel a little bit better about things, that they're kind of part of a bigger whole and they're not sort of isolated on a phone and are just at the whims of whatever future could happen if we don't take those bigger actions together?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you're saying, I think that eco-anxiety is becoming a lot more prevalent in the world, right? Like this feeling of anxiety, stress, sometimes even depression that can emerge based on the difficulties that we can see that are coming, right? Sort of with the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis. And I mean, just to kind of say first, like I don't have mental health training or anything like that in terms of being able to advise on that front. We did have an episode on our podcast with Caroline Hickman, who is a climate psychologist, and she talked a little bit through eco-anxiety, through some of the sort of mental concepts that can be helpful in dealing with it. So I would recommend going to look at that. More generally, I think building a sense of community is really important. And also, I mean, one thing that's big for me is that conservationists can be in lots of different places, right? And like conservation can take so many different shapes. I think that there has been this image of a conservationist as some sort of like explorer field biologist type, and it's almost like this idea that that is what being a conservationist is, when actually people can do conservation in so many different ways, and you might actually be really uniquely positioned in terms of having a skill set or being part of a community that other conservationists wouldn't be. And if you care about conservation and you can bring that to the table and you can make it actionable within that context, you might have a huge impact, and especially huge because maybe no one else would be doing it. So yeah, I think that's one big thing is sort of looking at your own context and recognizing the things that you might be able to do there. And so since I don't know what context somebody specific is going to be in, I think it can be hard to say exactly. But yeah, I think in a lot of cases it can be sort of taking those smaller actions that can help to build community, learning about the things that you care about, and also just doing general stuff that helps you feel better, right? Like going for a walk, spending some time in nature, doing some art. I love doing art. So yeah, small things like that. But obviously when it becomes a bigger issue, then being willing to reach out to a mental health professional or build community in the ways that you can.
Lovely. Okay, so moving on to the network itself now. Tell us a little bit about sort of the members, the organizations. What is it about these groups that are working on things that are worth highlighting? And what sort of themes and patterns and relationships do they have that makes conservation optimism unique?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the Conservation Now network.
Sorry,
right?
yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Conservation Now, the network under Conservation Optimism
Yeah,
umbrella.
yeah.
Is that the correct structure? I think
Yeah.
I've got that right, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So so Conservation Now stands for Conservation Network of Optimists Worldwide. And so the idea behind it was just to bring together organizations who had a similar ethos, right? Like wanting to kind of amplify positive messaging, think about solutions, as well as considering threats. And a lot of our initial members were people from that summit, right? Like that first summit, who kind of showed up because they were sort of drawn to that concept. And since then, we've really, really grown. So I am proud to say that we now have over 170 members within Conservation Now, which is really cool. And, Restore Our Planet is a member. And it's such a great mix of organizations that I think can really illustrate the fact that there are people who care about conservation who just are all over the planet and who are working on lots of different causes using different skill sets. And yeah, a really, really great mix of initiatives. I mean, we have, I guess like in some cases they're kind of academic initiatives. They might also be NGOs, sort of smaller community groups. It's really a mix in terms of who makes up the network. But a lot of the things that are great about it is that, it just sort of reflects the importance of using positive messaging, working together. Some of the, I suppose, like things that people in the network can do and organizations in the network can do are sort of, we can amplify messaging. So we as Conservation Optimism can act as a sort of like central node where then we can help to share things that the organizations within the network are doing, so we can amplify their messaging. You can always write a blog post for us. We can amplify stuff on social media. We do training, so we do things like webinars for our members. We share a lot of opportunities. So for example, for the last couple of years at least, we've been nominated for the Earthshot Prize, right? So being able to put members of the network up for that, also helping people to connect with other members, share opportunities. We send out like regular bulletins, things like that.
Fantastic. No, and I just have to say, from our end of things, a bigger part of Restore has been conservation now has been a fantastic resource, just networking and just information and so many other things.
I'm so glad.
Well, no, of course. Thank you. So, apart from what I just mentioned there in terms of Restore, what other things can members expect to gain from being a part of the network?
I suppose it's some of what I was just mentioning in terms of being able to amplify messaging, participate in training. We'll share whatever opportunities come our way. And I suppose just, being able to kind of connect with other members as well and share those opportunities.
Yeah, okay. And so tell me, it's quite a broad question here, but what does the future hold for conservation optimism? So we can think maybe perhaps more long-term and short-term. So for example, over the next couple of years, what exciting things do you have coming up? And how would you like to see things in the more distant future?
Well, I mean, I hope the future holds many great things for conservation optimism. I mean, I think in many ways it's so exciting to see that it's already happening. Because when I look on social media, when I talk to people, I can see increases in the way that people are talking about conservation, in the way that they're highlighting solutions, in the way that people are working together and sort of trying to find that optimistic way of talking about things and bringing lots of people on board. I think one of the most important things that we can do is to really help people tell effective stories within conservation and get lots of people on board who maybe otherwise wouldn't initially have been conservationists, right? Or wouldn't have been participating in those initiatives. I think that's something that's really important for us. Just continuing to build our community really and make it as beneficial for everyone involved as possible. We have our 5th year of the film festival this year, which is amazing to see. And yeah, I mean, in terms of other things we're working on, so one thing we're working on at the moment is a database of successes within conservation. So I'm working with a master's student at the University of Oxford on that. So that will be sort of developing, and I'm excited to see where that goes. It's something that we've been working on, sort of taking away in the past, but we're really kind of trying to push that forward now.
So just to break that down a little bit, how sorry to interrupt, how broad is that? So literally just as many positive things as possible, bring them into one centralized.
So we've had this idea for a while. I mean, I suppose we're kind of figuring out the exact format of it at the moment, but the idea is to just have a sort of central place where we can collect up some examples of things that have worked and really be able to make them accessible to people so that they can learn from them, right?
Incredible.
And amplify them. So we're going to be doing that. And then we, I guess, just want to see conservationists working together on all of these things and being able to talk about what they do in inspiring and positive ways.
Brilliant. And finally, what positive personal message would you like to share with our audience on conservation and being optimistic?
A positive personal message. I think maybe something, I mean, it sounds a bit like simple, I guess, but it's like we all need to be conservationists. We all can be conservationists in some way. If you care about the environment, like, yeah, you don't have to be climbing up a mountain. You can be making a difference within the space that you currently exist in. And if that's climbing a mountain, wonderful. If it's not, also wonderful. There's so many ways to be making a difference and moving forward. So yeah, I think that would be my message. And then also just to say, like, no one can do this on their own, right? Or maybe there's somebody who can, but in general, these things work so much better when we're working together. So just a huge thank you to our amazing team of volunteers and funders and everybody who has helped keep Conservation Optimism going.
Lovely. And finally, where can people find your work to follow what you're up to?
So you can
Perhaps
find us lots of places. We have a website, which is conservationoptimism.org. You can find us on social media. So our Twitter is @conserveoptimism. Our Instagram is @conservationoptimism. We are also present on LinkedIn, Facebook. Most places you want to go, we'll be there.
Lovely. Sophia, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.